We will also be taking we'll also be taking some photographs and pictures for the social media. Anyone who does not want their photograph to appear in any social media, please let us know in advance. All of us are sitting here. We request online participants to kindly mute your microphones. We will mute anyone who's not muted. Given that we have 2 hours, 1 presentation, 6 panelists, we are going to be very strict on time. I apologize in advance if I intervene while you're speaking and tell you to wind up quickly. I can be pretty ruthless. Also encourage everyone who's online to kindly submit any questions in chat throughout the event, and we will try to address them later on. I'm still trying to see if David can join, otherwise he's trying to join. In any case, we are gathered today as we prepare for, we are into the HLPF preparing for the SDG Summit. It's really important time for all of us to think about the future of multilateralism. It lies in the ability of high ambition coalitions like the Justice Action Coalition to solve problems and to drive progress in world's most pressing shared challenges. If David was here, he would also remind everyone that UN Foundation has recently published a challenge paper on justice as a Justice Action Coalition, as a model coalition. And it is one of the success stories at the, justice was a success story at the first SDG Summit, and it's time now to come back to the summit and show that we've achieved some progress, that some success has been achieved. For those of you who were here last time, yesterday, we did talk about how the Justice Action Coalition's ministerial meeting actually did showcase progress on what's happening in countries who are in Justice Action Coalition. Yesterday we spoke about data, importance of data. Today we are talking about financing and the importance of financing justice. We need to get serious about financing because we are hearing countries after countries at the SDG Summit, at HLPF and before, talking about, these promises of SDGs are good and they want to be doing things, but where is the money coming from? How do we get more resources? How do we get better resources? How do we spend them in a way that drive maximum impact for people, communities, and societies that need justice the most? So drawing on recent research, which has been ongoing on financing and on financing people-centered justice. David, are you back? Do you want to come in? I'm sorry, I'm doing your remarks.
I'm so sorry. I hope you can hear me now. We have a big heat wave and catastrophic storms here in Italy, so I think it's making our internet a little bit shaky today. I'm just struggling to catch up, but we're going to start the meeting hearing about some of the research on financing people-centered justice. And this is one of the big things I think that's changed in the last 4 years. 4 years ago at the first SDG Summit, we really didn't know what it cost to scale up the approaches that worked best. We didn't know the levels of investment that we needed. And now, thanks to some great research that we're going to hear from today, we're beginning to be able to answer those questions. So first, we're going to hear from Mariette Schuurman from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Netherlands. As I think all of you know, the Netherlands has done just a tremendous amount of work to get people-centered justice right at the heart of the SDG agenda. Then we'll go to hear about this ODI research, and we'll also be hearing about HiiL's research slightly later on. We'll then go across to the distinguished panelists who will be introduced as they speak. We do have 6 panelists and a presentation in just 2 hours, so we beg you to be to time. The Pathfinders team has a timer, and we will be showing you little cards if you go over too late. So please do stick to time. And in case Swati didn't say this when I was disappeared into the ether, this is a public event. We are recording. Recording's on. There will be photos and pictures. If you're allergic to having your photo taken, please tell one of the organisers, and we'll make sure that nothing is published, but otherwise you may
David, I
appear
did
on
the
social
logistics.
media. Okay, and stay muted if you're online. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And I'd like to start the meeting by handing over to Mariette, the Dutch MFA's Director of Stability and Humanitarian Aid, and invite her to give her opening remarks.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Swati. And thank you all. It's good to see you all online from this side, from The Hague, and to deliver some opening remarks. Obviously, this is a sequence we have been meeting for years and intensively at times, I think, on closing the global justice gap. And that's not only a political or a technical challenge, but it's clearly also a financial one. So therefore, I think today's session on justice financing is both topical and opportune as we live in times of competing demands. Swati, I think, mentioned already the SDG summit coming up, the discussions around climate financing. There's many other competing demands in times of economic difficult times. So justice financing needs to be structurally become part of this conversation too. And we need to put our money where our mouth is. We all agree, and have been repeating ourselves, I think, that SDG 16 is an enabler for all the other development goals. And we know that if people's lives get stuck by legal problems and issues, then people are effectively held back, wasting time and money and drawing resources away from productive activities. Not to speak of the additional stress experienced in families' lives and the tension that creates between people and within communities. So in fact, there is, and some of you alluded already, David, I think, to the studies being undertaken, but there seems to be a very sound business case why investing in justice is needed. And according to a cost-benefit analysis conducted in the Netherlands, for every €1 invested in justice, €4 are saved on transaction costs, that is, resources spent on attempting resolution, and €14 are saved in increased productivity, are gained in increased productivity, meaning the time spent on economic activities instead of coping with the impact of conflicts. So while the economic business case for investing in justice may be sound, the reality is that national justice systems are structurally underfunded. And a recent ODI study evidenced that lower income countries cannot afford even half the cost of our basic justice systems, even if they increase taxes by a maximum possible. And it's not realistic to expect low-income countries to substantially increase their national justice budgets through higher taxes or reprioritization of spending. In addition, an increase in ODA can only partially make up for the financing gap. So we must look towards a better use of resources. So how can we do that? And who else needs to be part of that conversation? On the first one, on the how, firstly, the Netherlands believes that we need to invest more in exploration and identify more effective, low-cost ways of delivering justice to people at the community level, providing justice solutions that are fair and address people's needs and priorities. There's already much analysis done on delivery models, such as one-stop shops, mobile courts, community paralegals, and innovative ways to deliver frontline services. This analysis must be consolidated to present clear business cases, which models works best, when, so where and why and how, in which context, under which circumstances. And that means giving partners space to experiment and innovate. We will continue to work with partners on these questions, including within the framework of the Justice Action Coalition. Mm-hmm. So on the who needs to be part of that conversation? We need to broaden the discussion and start involving additional actors. If we are serious about bringing our work to scale and impacting access to justice for people in a transformative manner. Governments can initiate a pivot towards people-centered justice reforms at country level, and the Justice Action Coalition that I mentioned intends to play a catalytic role in this. However, sustaining the momentum requires resources that go beyond the means currently offered by ODA. Philanthropic organizations can play a role here, for example, by supporting experimentation and innovation on community-based frontline service delivery and expanding proven successful solutions where these can be seen to promote social change. International financial institutions can play an instrumental role in supporting broad, people-centered justice reforms and further bring justice service delivery at scale. And this requires us to strengthen partnerships and build new ones with new actors to bring about the needed synergies. So in closing, I think these ideas and others that will be discussed today will also inform the work that we do collectively as part of the Justice Action Coalitions. So therefore, I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I see today's event as another important step in the journey ahead of us for justice, for us as a justice community. And indeed, you know, the next piece in the puzzle towards equal access to justice for all. So thank you for joining the conversation and look forward to the conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. I mean, I think you've emphasized the importance of the Justice Action Coalition as a platform for driving the next stage of progress, this pivot to people-centered justice, as you put it. And I hope that we're going to hear quite a lot more in the conversation about the diversity of finance that we need to support that pivot. And you mentioned governments, you mentioned IFIs, you mentioned the role of philanthropy, and also the newer sources of finance we bring into the sector. We're now going to move on to Marcus, who, along with Claire at ODI, has, I think, done a tremendous job in recent years in really beginning to give us a sense of what it costs to finance people-centered justice and where that money might come from. So we're now going to hear Marcus's presentation, and we'll hear from Claire later in the program. Marcus, over to you.
David, thank you very much, and thank you very much for this invitation. It's great to see so many people gathered in the room. Also great to see people like Clifford gathering from Malawi, and Yoko, I know, who must be up very late in Tokyo, joining this call. I just want to present 9 key findings that we've come up with so far from the research of where we got to so far, and then to present just a few proposals of what that might mean in terms of next steps. And so the first key finding, a universal, basic, people-centered justice system is affordable. These are not unaffordable systems. So what we've done here is we have costed the universal access for 3 basic services sectors. So education comes from UNESCO, the health comes from a lot of World Bank and WHO work. And you can see from here that justice, we reckon, in a low and lower middle income countries comes out about $34 on average per person every year. Education comes out at 41 and health comes out at 77. So justice is certainly in line with what's needed in other sectors. So this is not an unaffordable stretch. The second key finding is that lower income countries are already prioritizing justice in their spending. And so this next slide looks at what the spend is as a percentage of government revenues on justice at the moment. On average, you'll see whether it's low income or lower middle income or upper middle income country, they all spend about 7% of their government revenues on justice. Now, this is much higher than the average in the OECD, which is just over 4%. So it's not for a lack of prioritization for the overall justice sector that is the issue when we come to think about financing. The third key finding, which has already been alluded to, thank you, in the introduction, is just the poorest countries, however, do face the greatest financing gap. So this chart here looks at the current levels of spending on justice relative to the costs of a universal basic justice system. So as we can see in the bottom, the low-income countries, they can't even afford half the amount that's needed to finance just a basic system, let alone a full-blown justice system. And even if they increase their taxes to the maximum amount possible, they would still stay below that 50% line. Lower middle income countries are a bit better off. Upper middle income countries are possibly over the edge, and so there is some scope. Whereas in OECD countries, their spending on justice would be more than enough to do, a basic system. And I say a basic system is a pretty basic system, but it just illustrates how basic we've designed that. But in terms of the gap is so much greater in the poorer countries, and that's quite clear. Fourth key finding, the level of aid to justice. This continues to be falling, and it's fallen by 27% in real terms over the last 10 years. This chart shows justice aid, which comprises, from our viewpoint, 3 separate areas. Human rights is the bit shown in orange. The bit in grey is called legal and judicial development, which, if you like, is sort of the mainstreaming and can be anything from prisons, police, community paralegals, the whole range. And then the yellow one is a new category that's measured in the aid statistics, which just looks at violence against women and girls. So what we can also see is not only has aid decreased, and indeed aid's share of aid has decreased even more, from 2.9 to 1.4%. And this compares with a 4.3% share of donors' own national budgets. So donors prioritize justice in their own budgets much more than they come to prioritize their own aid budgets. As this chart also shows, the justice aid is increasingly focused on specific issues, human rights and violence against women and girls. And so the amount that's available for supporting the broad systems has become increasingly decreased. Justice aid averages $1 per person per year. That's true in low-income countries and lower-income countries. It's about the same average, curiously. And that compares to a cost of a basic justice system in a low-income country of $20 per person per year. So as we say, aid is not going to solve the whole problem, but making sure we use aid to the best effect is really important because it's a key additional potential element. The fifth key finding, frontline services are relatively cheap. And when we did our costing exercise, we estimated these amounted to about 5% of the basic people-centered justice system. So therefore, if you're thinking that $20 is the total cost in a low-income country, if you want to deliver people-centered justice, the very frontline services, you're only talking $1 per person per year. So those really are quite cheap. By that, we particularly are thinking of 2 aspects, and this isn't an exhaustive definition, but gives you an idea. The first one is the work that's been done by Pathfinders, by Clifford, in prisoners in Malawi, a model that's used in many other parts of the world now. And then also the work that many of us recognize on legal advice, assistance, and sometimes dispute resolution as well for communities and individuals. It can be this legal advice center, it could be a village court. There are a range of ways that this is provided and dealt with. Key finding 6. So the latest research has confirmed that there are multiple local, innovative, frontline people-centered justice services with low unit costs. And these are quite remarkable. So in low-income countries, the sort of benchmark we'd set from earlier research was that we thought it might be possible to deliver for less than $20 per case. In a lower middle-income country, we're a bit higher because salary rates are a bit higher in lower middle-income countries. The benchmark is more like $50. Lots of people said those were far too low, they were unachievable. And there's lots of evidence we found of organizations that provide these services at $100 or even $500 per case. But what the research has now come out from looking at 12 countries across 4 continents, there are 11 examples that are operating below the ODA benchmark. And there are 12 examples of some new, smaller scale interventions that we think could fall below the benchmark if they were scaled up. So in a sense, in terms of exploration, and thank you to the MOT and to the Dutch who helped fund some of this research in our research program, there is some really interesting stuff going on at a local level. It's quite difficult to find, but it's happening there, and it was really encouraging piece of what we've been researching recently. And this just gives you an idea of the scale of coverage. We're talking here from Haiti to the Solomon Islands, from Tajikistan down to Malawi, and lots of countries in between. Very much focused on the lower income countries. That's where we wanted to look at in the research. The key finding 7, this new methodology of looking at legal needs and looking at what we do has enabled an assessment of coverage relative to needs. So we're moving beyond saying there are all these legal needs that are not met to saying, okay, how many providers are there, and what's the level of support they can provide relative to the need. So suddenly, beyond noting that lots of children need immunizing, we can actually say, okay, how many children have we managed to immunize, and how does that compare with the target population? So we're beginning to move in terms of thinking about our coverage. The striking news is many of you will know about BRAC in Bangladesh and the work they do. They've enabled oral rehydration salts to reach every village in Bangladesh, but their work they're doing on justice is only reaching 1% of the needs of Bangladesh. PASI, that's been working for a long time, doing some amazing work on village mediation, we reckon they're only still meeting 3% of the needs in Malawi, and Clifford is well aware of how much more he would like to do to scale it up. Rwanda, there's quite a lot of CSOs, a range of activities. Collectively, we think they're doing 10%. But what the striking thing is, in Sierra Leone, we have one example of where we think we're getting up to 52% of coverage, which is quite an extraordinary proportion. Now, there's some precise questions of whether we've got the measurement quite right, but at least in terms of relative to different countries, we're using the same methodology. So what we can say is that Sierra Leone is doing something very different from Rwanda or Uganda or Malawi. And that, I think, is helping us to engage. And things are beginning to happen at scale, which I think is both striking and encouraging. The next key finding, my penultimate one, is that scale delivers sustainable costs. So what we're looking at here is the unit cost on the left-hand side. And you can see there's a blue dot at the top, which is a cost of over $90 per case. This is taken from Malawi's village mediation, but you get very high costs when you have a relatively few number of cases being resolved. So this is looking at Malawi's village mediation by district, and over a period, for each observation is one district in 1 year. And we're looking at over a 6-year period. So as districts start, they don't tend to be able to reach very many, and you see their unit costs are very high, $90, $60, $40. You can see that from the chart. When you can really move to scale, and if you look at, say, just between, when you get to, say, like 2,000 or 3,000 cases a year, the unit costs have come down to below 10, and in fact, average $10, below 20, and in fact, average $10. And when you get up to the really high reach numbers, you're looking at figures below $10. So we know that scale delivers, and this is a really vivid example of what scale means when you can deliver at scale, what it does to your costs. And the final funding is that scale also determines the SDG impact. So this is a work we've looked at, is looking at what happens using the same model, but different level of effort. And this is to do with releasing prison paralegals. So the first column measures how many detainees, unsentenced detainees, does an organization reach each month as a proportion. So if we look at the Malawi case, we see 96% of unsentenced detainees are supported each month. So each detainee is getting a visit once a month. In Bangladesh, you've got the same model, but the ratio is only 4%. Now look at the right-hand side. This is the percentage of prisoners that are on pre-trial detention. This is the SDG indicator, 16.3.2. In Bangladesh, it's been stuck at 76% or around there for the last 10 years. In Malawi, it used to be 50 or 60%, but ever since the PASI Malawi work has been scaled up, it's been below 20%. That is lower than the OECD average of 24%. So there's a real clear correlation that if you intensify the effort, you can actually shift the SDGs. And I think this is a very interesting example of what we're doing. So we do know the right model, and now we're beginning to know what's the level of effort we need to do in order to actually deliver on that. So scale determines the SDG impact. So what might it mean for discussion? We just wanted to throw out some ideas that researchers might want to take forward. We need to keep going with these legal needs surveys. We wouldn't be able to get anywhere without these legal needs surveys. They're fundamental. All the work that WJP and HiiL do are fundamental to our research and the numbers you've just seen. And that applies to some stuff that falls across funders as well. I'm just going to stop with 3 very quick examples of what this might mean in practice, because I know I'm already over my 10 minutes and I'm sure I'm getting a yellow card, which I might not be able to see. Anyway, let's quickly go. So if we wanted to scale up the work we're seeing on criminal justice to the same level of intensity that Malawi does, in low-income countries, we could do that for $19 million a year. That's 1% of the justice aid we currently spend. So if we wanted to get unsentenced rates down to 20%, deliver on SDG 16.3.2, we now know how much it will cost. And it's not a lot of justice aid. If we want to scale up community-based legal advice, that costs more, it's much more complicated. But again, if we just want to do low-income countries, we're talking $230 million a year, which is 8% of justice aid. And the final one, we can't do this out without legal needs. And if we do legal needs surveys in every income country in every 3 years, which is what we're trying to do on extreme poverty, we're talking 3 million every 3 years, 0.03% of justice aid. But unless we do this, we really won't be knowing what we're able to do. Thank you very much indeed for your patience and that quick whistle-stop tour. I'll hand back the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcus. I mean, some very clear messages there. This is affordable, but we're not spending the money that we need to spend. In fact, budgets are going down, but increasingly we know what to scale up. And if we do scale up effectively, we bring unit costs down and impact up. I'm now going to turn to Teresa Smoot, who is a program director at HiiL, where she covers people-centered justice programs in Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Uganda. And HiiL is and like ODI, HiiL is another organization that's put real investment into understanding what it takes to finance people-centered justice. So, Teresa, you know, ODI's research has called for learning from other sectors on how to massively scale up people-centered justice programs. What comes out of HiiL's research on financing people-centered justice, and particularly that 2020 trends report that you did? How do you think this? How does HiiL think the sector should move towards financing universal access for the people who need it most? You have 3 minutes, David. By the way.
Yes, thank you, David. Thanks for the reminder as well. Greetings to everybody in this conversation. On behalf of HiiL, we really welcome the opportunity to share what we're learning from both the research and our programs on the ground, thanks to support from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So let me just put this quickly in context and say a lot of what I'm going to be sharing this afternoon is really talking about outcomes. And this comes up frequently. So please keep this in mind when I go into the discussion on financing, specifically answering David's question. So we know from our surveys that there's a pretty clear story. People want solutions, they want help with reaching out to the other party, fairness, to be listened to, mostly peace of mind. And justice practitioners want to help deliver those fair outcomes. So when we're talking about charging for justice and how we presented in the trend report of 2020, we're really talking about charging for outcomes. And I think this is important to stress again and again. So the data that we're going to show is really looking at that orange part of the bridge. A lot of the funding that's now going to the justice sector is covering what we see there from government, private legal aid, volunteer self-help, but really this part that's in the orange, the innovative, standardized, scalable services, that remains really unfunded. And that's the funding opportunity essentially. So our 3 core messages or key points we really want to highlight in this message is that securing political will and leveling the playing field for game changers is really, really important. Although difficult, we're managing to make traction on that front, but essentially safeguarding the core funding for courts and lawyers. Secondly, R&D and innovation replacing current services, And then really also making sure that immediate needs are not forgotten in the equation. So specifically, what do I mean by that? Unpacking it a little bit further, the trend report that came out in 2020, which HiiL was leading, 7 core messages come out of that. We think that very much like the health, education, and water sectors, setting an inspiring goal of 100% access to justice for the most urgent and frequent justice problems is needed. So I think that's the starting point. Then safeguarding core funding and matching that with smart contributions. So smart fees meaning increasing contributions by beneficiaries and government agencies for effective services. And much of our research shows that people are willing to pay for services that deliver the outcomes that they're looking for. But then also decreasing general subsidies will also fall into that category. And then also looking at how revenues generated by the justice sector organizations themselves can be kept within the sector and then reinvested for continual improvements. The regulatory space, of course, for game changers. So remember the bridge I showed a couple of seconds ago? That's really important. So making sure that that orange part where the innovation is happening, that is covered by regulatory, the regulatory environment. So improving on that front, attracting investment for developing services. So outcome-based, again, very much scalable, financially sustainable. And I will show you in the final slide that I have how we've applied this to a potential funding model. Also emphasizing, of course, local delivery and developing a free basic justice care package. And finally, really supporting local delivery with world-class know-how. So 3 main funding streams. I think we're going to hear this again and again. The government catalytic, focusing on innovation and research and development, and really channeling support to grassroots and frontline service providers. So those 3 main funding streams, really stressing that we see this again and again coming out of the research that we're carrying out. If we apply, when we mapped out again what a potential funding model could look like, using the Netherlands and Ethiopia as country case studies, we placed key priorities we hear coming from our consultations, from our research, from our various activities around the key things that we do at country level. And we placed it into what could be a hypothetical funding model. This is what we look at. And I'm just going to leave with one main food for thought. You can see very clearly there that R&D and innovation ends up being the chunk of where funding support is needed. And that's really, really striking because again, it goes back to the bridge and what I talked about being that orange part that really needs the funding support. And this is backed up again when we just take government or national priorities and we place it in a hypothetical funding model. Let me leave it there and I'm available to answer questions later on. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you for putting it so clearly out there for us. Maybe I should move now very quickly. Sorry, we're trying this hybrid and hopefully this works. But I will now move on to you, Katie.
Oh,
Katie Thompson.
oh, really? Okay.
Is,
I was following the agenda.
okay. I think
okay.
I had shared the list of questions and maybe you didn't get to see that, but Katie is the head of Rule of Law and Rule of Law, Security and Human Rights at UNDP headquarters. She manages with the Department of Peace Operations, the UN Global Focal Point for Rule of Law, and oversees the implementation of UNDP's global program for strengthening rule of law and human rights. She's an experienced leader in rule of law, peace building and development. Katie, thank you for joining us. The question for you is that UNDP has now been working with governments to change the way that justice budgets are allocated and spent. In your experience, what motivates justice and finance ministers to shift towards a more people-centered approaches?
Thank you. Thanks, Swati. Thanks for organizing this meeting. It's great to have this on the side of the HLPF, and thanks to the colleagues sharing online the interesting observations with regard to financing justice. It's a great time for us to be reflecting on this particular issue as a halfway point to 2030. And let's be frank, that, generally with regard to the SDGs as a whole, and including with regard to goal 16 globally, we don't see an enormous amount of progress against the goals that have been set at national level, nor in the overall conditions of peace, security, and respect for human rights. So conversations about innovations or commitments or how to bring about political change are really important at this moment. I got to say that I don't think that financing of justice is necessarily the same as financing people-centered justice. So I want to sort of take a moment to reflect on that and take a moment trying to abstract a little bit from what UNDP does to see if we can move the conversation a little bit on the people-centered front and to start to think about an articulation of what that actually means and what that can look like concretely on the ground. And I say from the top that we don't have the answers. I think we should start to have that conversation in a fairly frank and open way. And I don't think it's too far from many priorities or criteria that we've discussed in the past, such as rights-based approaches, working for the furthest behind first, focusing on leave no one behind, tackling the quality of problem solving, not just quantity, so outcomes being important, respect for the independence of the judiciary, and obviously working towards integrated governance approaches at country level that focus on responsive services and accountable government in a context where parliaments, taxation systems and so on are working in a non-corrupt manner that underwrites systemic support to justice as a whole. So what do we do specifically? I mean, many of you will be aware through UNDP's country offices and country presences, we work very closely with governments with regard to development planning, macroeconomic planning, in particular with regard to with the SDG framework as our backbone. Clearly, the specific focus on indicators around civil justice and legal aid are very helpful entry points for advocacy when our country offices are working with governments in terms of setting their annual budgets and their development priorities within development plans. But equally important is our engagement to support the development of taxation systems, revenue systems that meet the needs of the global budget and a balanced budget, which does not, for example, over prioritize defense concerns as opposed to developmental concerns such as health, education, justice, and so on. So balancing civilian needs and defense needs is a very important piece of how we work with governments. We also work with parliaments and parliamentary committees to look at oversight of the budgets that are developed at national level. Very important role in terms of the democratic developments to be able to support the capacities of parliamentarians to work closely on accounting and work closely with the ministries to oversee the budgets they put forward. To double check that the priorities actually meet the needs of their constituents and their populations. You'll see if you take a look at the work in the Pacific Island countries, Tonga, Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, we work very closely every year, on every financial year with the parliamentarians to support their capacities to do this work. Of course, in complement, we work with frontline services. Moldova, Pakistan, the Gambia, across a whole host of crisis countries with regards to legal aid provision. Our experiences funding legal aid provision and frontline services does not mean that we're necessarily changing the respect for rule of law globally. And I think I'd be interested to know from the ODI reflections whether the increase in justice support that was happening in the early 2000s that we saw there actually was reflected in an increase in respect for the rule of law and human rights globally or not. So when we increase the investment in justice, are we increasing respect for human rights? That's something that I think we need to bring an answer to in order to compel donors in particular to invest more in this sphere. Because if they're investing in justice services without that concomitant respect in addressing leave no one behind, addressing inequality, addressing discrimination, there'll be a question as to whether those frontline services are merely humanitarian in need, in approach or not. And I think that part of this analysis needs to be clearer for that case to be compelling. So I think that that's a part we also struggle with. And I'm putting it out there because I think we need to work together and put out quite significant resources that go into research and data and mapping to address that question, to be compelling, because ultimately the SDGs are integrated. It isn't only about one indicator, it is about an integrated approach for improving the condition of human rights and the SDGs as a whole. I got you.
Sorry, Katie, and thank you for that. I think the last point that you made, does increased investment lead to increased outcomes, better outcomes? And I think we've been hearing this in the sector now for some time, that perhaps the reason that the investment fell was because we couldn't show results. And it would be good to come to that at some point, Claire, but for now, maybe let's move on to Andrews. Andrews Kananga is a lawyer and executive director of Legal Aid Forum in Rwanda. As founding member of the African Center of Access to Justice, he currently heads the research department within the center, driving evidence-based approaches to enhance access to justice. Andrews, thanks for joining us. The ACE-AJ has a network of organizations that are delivering frontline services across the African continent. Why do you believe that frontline providers are a cost-effective way of providing justice to people and communities that need it most? You have 3 minutes, please.
Thank you. I think those of you have been interacting with the continent in terms of legal services or justice services, as opposed to some parts of where you come from.
Sorry, could you speak a little louder so we can hear you? Sorry.
Oh, okay. I'm saying Africa is very particular in the sense that we have justice institutions that many of the development partners have been supporting for so many years. We had a lot of support to restructure, reform our justice systems. We have judiciaries that are working, we have Minister of Justice, Office of the Attorney General, all these structures exist. But we have a lot of issues that are unresolved, justice issues that are unmet. I think when you talk about Africa, we have the biggest challenge. So looking at what we are doing as civil society, and looking at how paralegals deliver, community mediation deliver, I think for us, that is the best way to go. Of course, I'm not saying we shouldn't work with formal institutions, but frontline justice services are better provided by community paralegals. Just an example of what Marcus presented, because they are very close to the community. They understand the conflict dynamics within their community. They are trusted in some instances than we trust judges and prosecutors and lawyers. And they are less costly. They're not expensive. You take an example of how much we spend on our paralegals and village mediators in Malawi. You can't compare. So I think frontline justice service providers, as we are talking about meeting SDG 16, with the justice gap that we've been measuring, we started in sessions yesterday, where we are talking about incredible data of the needs. We know the needs, and some of these needs will not only be met by courts, judges, and prosecutors. We are talking about simple issues regarding land. How do you register land? How do you report a crime? You don't need an investigator to be on the field for these small issues. We are talking about information, providing basic information, justice information for our people to know where to go if they have legal needs. So I think that is where we stand as the African Center, and this is what we are trying to do.
Thank you so much for that. And it's I think really important to join that perspective up to some of the research that we've heard from both Marcus and Teresa, which is, in part recommending investing in precisely those kind of services. I'm going to switch focus a little bit now, going to Kelechi Achinunu, who is many things. She's a Nigerian lawyer. She works for HiiL on justice innovation in West Africa. She's one of the first cohort of young justice leaders, a group set up by the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies, and an outcome from the process that led to our common agenda. And she's also a UN Next Generation Fellow, where she works on people-centered justice. Kelechi, it's great to have you here. As a young justice leader, you're working with the other young justice leaders, with the action group on justice, to campaign for greater investment in people-centered justice. At the SDG Summit, what will you be asking governments, international institutions, philanthropists, and other funders to do? What are the asks?
Thank you very much, David. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion. As a young justice leader and the Next Gen Fellow for Justice at the UNF, I think I represent the millions globally who lack access to justice. According to the Task Force on Justice, which commissioned the work from the World Justice Project, over 5 billion people suffer from unmet justice, and I think that this is something that has been said again and again. However, despite the immense potential of people-centered justice to provide an effective way of tackling justice issues, it seems that people-centered justice is still underfunded and under-prioritized. As we have heard, 1.8% of official development assistance is allocated to justice, and most of this is spent on state institutions rather than addressing people's needs directly. This imbalance should be rectified if we are to make substantial progress on achieving justice for all. Now at the SDG Summit, we, and I speak for myself and other young people who are stakeholders in this sense, people-centered justice, will be asking for 4 things. The first thing will be that the member states of the Justice Action Coalition commit to returning in a year with a report detailing the proportion of their budgets that's been allocated to people-centered justice. Also asking that at the next SDG Summit after this year, these states present a report detailing their progress and achievements in financing people-centered justice. Secondly, echoing the recommendations of the ODI, we're asking that donors direct 4% of their funding to scaling up strategies that have been seen to work. Now, from community paralegals and services to legal empowerment programs to frontline services to mobile courts, we have a lot of models that deserve greater investment and wider implementation. Thirdly, foundations seem to express alignment with the concept of justice, but do not actively support it. I urge them to walk the talk. People-centered justice is a cross-cutting issue integral to all aspects of development and human rights, and it warrants their active support. Lastly, we are asking that every actor that spends on justice dedicate at least 10% of their budget to supporting justice innovators under the age of 30. Young people are the vanguards of our future, brimming with innovative ideas that can transform our justice system. Today, my ask at this time from all actors are clear. We must invest, innovate, and scale people-centered justice solutions to address the justice gap effectively. It is both a necessity, a right, and the path to a more equitable world. I hope that I've been able to make good use of my 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kelechi. You've made excellent, superb use of your 3 minutes with some really crunchy asks, 4 asks, one for governments, particularly focused on the justice action, coalition, one for international donors, one for the foundations that are not investing in justice, that they talk the talk on justice, and one for the priority of funding a new generation of justice innovators. We'd be really interested to hear what you think of those asks and to hear questions that are coming as you listen to the panelists. We've now got about 60 people online and a big crowd of people in the room. If you're online and have a question, please put it into chat or get your hand up and we'll try and bring you into the discussion later on. But it'd be great to see some questions in chat. With that, back to you in the room, Swati.
Thanks, David. Let's move on now to Shelley Inglis. Shelley is the Senior Policy Advisor at USAID's Bureau for Democracy, Rights and Governance. She was formerly the Executive Director of Human Rights Center at the University of Dayton. And before that, she spent 15 years working with UNDP and the United Nations system. Shelley, thank you for joining us. And I think one of what Katie said and what I would like really Claire and you both also to address is in terms of, so it's not only about how much are we investing, but what are we investing on that will make us see the results, right? So where USAID, thankfully, and we are very, very happy about it, that has made this shift in your rule of policy to people-centered justice. Can you comment on what led to this decision? How did you come about it? What will this mean in practice? Will it impact? If so, how? Your funding priorities and modalities? And do you hope other governments follow suit?
Yeah, thank you, Swati, and thank you, David, and other colleagues, everyone, for collaborating with us on this really important event and for organizing it on financing justice. Yeah, just to say, as Katie said, you know, stepping back, obviously the United States is very committed to reaching SDG 16 and in fact to the implementation of the 2030 agenda in full, all 17 goals, of which we think, you know, justice financing is important for 16 as well as catalytic for other goals. So it's really about the big picture and what we're trying to achieve in terms of global progress. And, you know, for us, the rule of law policy that we just published is a part of that broader commitment. So it lies within that context. And notably, it's the USAID's, you know, first ever rule of law policy. So really, we hadn't had a very specific policy, but of course, you know, this is a reflection of, I think, 2 factors that really played into why we needed a policy at this point. The first is pretty obvious, and I'm sure you all know that there are substantial threats to achievement of the SDGs, to democracy, to sort of human rights and rule of law globally, including a justice gap that has been clearly identified by colleagues here. And that trajectory just isn't what we want to be seeing. So that's driven a sort of policy statement on our side. And the second thing is we wanted to update our rule of law assistance to the 21st century, to addressing the needs and challenges that we see now after having over 20 years of assistance and learning some lessons from what we were doing. So those are the 2 factors that drove that. We do think, you know, it's important that the pivot of USAID is to people-centered justice, that we've sort of outlined what we think that is and how we think we can reach it, both in terms of, you know, innovation, data-driven, low cost and other solutions that we can support. But I want to be clear, obviously, to everyone here that that doesn't mean that we are disregarding justice institutions. It doesn't mean it's not a rule of law policy framed on, as Katie rightfully said, you know, the UN definition and the overall outcomes we want to see in terms of human rights, rule of law, and democracy. So this is not a pivot away from rule of law. It's a new entry point, and it's a way of working with justice institutions, strengthening justice institutions in terms of people's actual experiences with them, outcomes with them, what they get from justice institutions, how justice institutions, both formal and informal, respond, and how they build trust and strengthen accountability and do the things that we want to see in terms of creating an environment where people can get their justice needs met. So just to be clear, this is not a substantial departure. It is a new entry point, and we have new ways of trying to do it. So our real focus at this point is implementation of our policy in terms of our programs. We have a number of new programs in the field, in countries like Ukraine and Kosovo and many others, which I can talk about, Colombia, if you would like. And we're really looking at how do these new programs change what we do? And how are we going to learn from them? How are we going to iterate quickly and be responsive, be data-driven? And we know that there's also political economy concerns. There's also a range of things that go into whether programs can be adaptive, effective in country. So finally, just to do that, and I'm going to stop there, we've launched something called our Rule of Law Ideas Lab. And IDEAS stands for Innovation, Design, Experimentation, Acceleration, and Solutions. Lots of words there, but the idea is really to do data-driven programming, to learn from our programming quickly, to do local sort of development of programs based on data and iteration, so that we're really learning what are the things that work in terms of people-centered justice, which hopefully we can work with you all on.
Thank you, Shelley, and very important points there. And I think it's always important to be mindful that people-centered justice does not mean anti-institutions, not working with institutions. I think that's something that came out in HiiL's presentation also. The core functions of the state is to provide justice. You have to safeguard that. But how do we move beyond that? What are our entry points? How do institutions treat people? How do they build trust with people? Some of the points that you mentioned. How do we improve people's experiences of dealing with the institutions and trying to get justice through them, but also thinking beyond than just institutions. How do we focus on frontline services? On that note, moving on to Claire. Claire is a senior research associate for the Politics and Governance program at ODI. She's a lawyer specializing in access to justice, financing for justice. We don't get many of those. Business enabling environment, women in business, institutional strengthening, legal reform, and adaptive programming. Thank you for joining us, Claire. We started with Marcus and Marcus' overview of your joint research. Having listened to the panelists, what would your advice be to the people-centered justice movement as it attempts to achieve a substantial increase in the quantity, quality, and accessibility of funding?
Thank you, Swati, and thank you everybody, all the panelists, for such a rich and interesting discussion. That's a big question, and I'm just going to make 3 points that I hope will touch on other points that panelists have made. So the first point is, I think we need a new mindset, and Teresa mentioned this vision of scaling up, of actually thinking about providing nationwide services to people, people-centered justice services at the front line. I think that's something that we haven't really thought hard enough about in the past in the justice sector. And I think our research, ODI's research, shows that it is achievable, it is affordable, but it does require really bearing down on cost, thinking really hard about cost effectiveness. I was very struck in our research at how many evaluations there are of justice services which have a really strong focus on effectiveness, but really don't think about cost effectiveness. And it's been said that's like clapping with one hand. You can do well, but it's about doing it at low cost if you're thinking about going to scale. So a new mindset. My second point is it requires thinking really hard about resources. And we've heard quite a lot from UNDP about engaging with governments on their budgets. And I think thinking about things like public expenditure reviews of the justice sector is really interesting. We've heard from HiiL about private sector funding and the potential for users to pay. Yes, that there may be mileage in that for some kinds of justice problems, not for all, not all justice problems can be monetized. But I do think we need to be crystal clear about the distinction between the situation in higher income countries, where really we're talking about how can we use existing resources better if we're going to think about frontline services, and lower income countries where there's just this massive gap. And if that gap is going to be met, we need to think about external funding, including ODA. And that brings me to my final point, which is, I think the scope to just start funding frontline services. Our research, our latest research, as Marcus said, has found a whole range of justice services at the front line, which are highly innovative. They've been developed by local entrepreneurs. They're context specific. Andrews is an example of a justice entrepreneur who's in charge of an organization that is delivering justice to thousands of people. And we found examples across 12 different lower income countries of these extraordinary entrepreneurs who are doing just this. What is stopping them from going to scale is money, quite frankly. They're providing these services cost effectively, and what they need is funding. So 2 quick points on that, on the funding. If we're thinking about external funding, it can be very hard for external funders to give money direct to service providers. Some of the service providers we found were government. An example was the Sierra Leone Legal Aid Board. Some were civil society. For either, it can be hard for funders to give money direct to those kind of organizations. So we need to think about what kind of funding modalities can deliver that kind of money. And the second point is results, and Katie picking up on aid and results. As Swati said, I do think that has been a real problem of the justice sector, and I think the declining aid to justice is closely associated with the failure of the justice system to demonstrate results. And I think a laser focus on delivering results will itself crowd in more funding. It's developing a virtuous circle of results crowding in more funding, and so it goes on. So totally agree with what Teresa said about focusing on outcomes and results. That was 3 minutes.
Thank you, Claire, and I will, moderating, I will take, abuse my privilege and go back to you maybe, sorry. 2 points that come out of your thing, and then maybe I'll open up to panelists for reflections on what all of you have said. One is this point of, and you normally do say that, is you did not talk about how health and education were able to demonstrate results, what changed, and how is that relevant to the justice sector, which is also connected with the other point, is that the reason justice sector perhaps has not been able to show results is because the expectations that we in our program documents put across are too high. If we do capacity building for judges, there will be rule of law, people will start respecting it, and then there'll be democracy, and then there'll be human rights, and everything on this earth will follow if you invest in justice. So I think somewhere also thinking about what the expectations are, what are the results we're looking at if we invest into that sector, and managing those expectations, and maybe learning from health and education in that aspect and how that relates to frontline services. And I shall stop it over to you for 2 minutes.
Okay, Marcus knows more about health and education than I do, but I will just say very quickly that data was key. So gathering data, understanding what the needs were, and being able to measure them, and being able to measure the impact of increased resources, and also a really strong focus on primary health and primary education. And I think our focus on frontline services kind of mirrors that approach. In terms of what you're trying to do in the justice sector, are we being too ambitious? I had a really interesting and stimulating discussion with Adrian just before we started this meeting about, what is justice? Is it about rule of law? Is it about holding governments to account, human rights, these really high-level accountability issues that are so difficult, that involve institutional reform, capacity development, that are going to take generations to shift? Or possibly, and are we talking about service delivery at the front line? Are we talking about people's everyday justice problems, being able to go and get some support and advice if your partner is abusing you, if someone's stolen something from you, if you've got a dispute with your neighbour? I think we're probably talking about both, but I think in terms of SDG 16.3, and certainly the access to justice point, we're thinking about service delivery. And I think that's where looking at what health and education have done is really, really interesting. And that's where things like unit costs come in.
Thank you. David, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to see, that we do have models where there has been a demonstration of much wider social impact. So the Citizen Advice Service in the UK is able to demonstrate £14 in wider economic and social benefits for every pound it spends, as well as direct benefits for the individual itself. But I think, maybe this is a good time to go back to you, Marcus. What did health and education really do that convinced people that results were being achieved and it was worth investing more? And are there lessons that you'd like to add to what we've already heard from Claire about what we should learn from the justice sector?
David, thank you. And I think there is a lot to be learned from the health and the education side. And David, you and I, a lot of this work came off a conversation you and I had about this. But, for example, one thing, when the Millennium Development Goals were created, the health sector was equally challenged about, well, how do we deliver primary health? It's only got to reduce these number of children who are dying. And, we don't necessarily know how to do that. And I think donors led the way, really. Donors, had limited health resources, so they wanted to work out how they should prioritize their health spend. And then they realized, well, actually, governments aren't prioritizing primary health either, so we should be talking to them about how they prioritize. So this was a whole circle that got going. I think the challenge we have is that the justice sector, what we're doing on the aid side is actually cutting edge, because the same issues are actually applicable in our own countries. We know the challenges about funding frontline services are very severe in the UK or in Australia or in many other places. And therefore, what we're trying to get as a shift is sort of, everyone's trying to move at the same stage. In health, at least, a lot of the analysis had already been done in some of the richer countries. But it does mean a quite radical thing. I mean, I remember on the education 20 years ago, education projects were all about training teachers or developing the curriculum. And the fact that half the kids weren't in school was sort of, okay, well, that's slightly inconvenient, but let's carry on, because all we need to make sure is the curriculum is focused on the 20th century needs for the curriculum. And so I think, sometimes you do just need a complete paradigm shift, and this kind of work is part of that process. Thank you.
And maybe handing it back to Teresa at this point, you presented that nice spectrum with a big slice on the right hand side of my screen, which is the kind of the need for innovation and where we need completely different approaches. Are you able to come in, Teresa, and really say a little bit more about where you think that innovation could be focused, and maybe some of the reactions to what you've heard from other speakers?
Yes, thank you, David. Maybe I can start with just sharing a quick experience I had from a conversation recently with a High Court judge who said, I spent my entire weekend writing up judgments. We're really pushed to the edge of what we can do now. With the best of intentions, we can't take on anymore. And I think that just really is something to keep in mind when we're asking the formal system to expand to meet the unmet justice needs, is really how much more can the formal sector do to meet demands. But going straight to your question then, when we're looking at that second pillar, so the R&D and innovation part, we see that quite a lot of the emphasis is put on evidence-based resolution of justice problems. So everything around guideline development, implementation, and improved capacity of users, innovation that helps with community justice services. Community justice comes up quite a lot. And it's not only learning from what frontline service providers are actually doing and efficiently and how they need to get to scale with investment, but it's also in some instances bringing them into the current century kind of thing, modernizing what it is that they're doing. So a focus on, yes, it is working, but what can be done to really bring them into being perhaps a human rights compliant, or making sure that they, what it is that they're providing, there's a minimum quality service across the board. So ADR, formal justice, looking at people-centered civil and criminal procedures. But again, developing scalable, game-changing service delivery models, that is really what gets a lot of the justice practitioners, including at the leadership level, really interested in learning more. So they are thinking now beyond just what the formal sector can provide and realistically expand to accommodate. Yeah.
And Kelechi, coming back to you, I mean, one of your 4 asks was earmarking an allocation of funding for younger innovators. What change do you think that finance can deliver in the field? What's your experience of what young people are able to bring that is different, that is new, that is scalable, that is game changing?
Okay, thank you very much, David. So I believe that we as young people have the creativity, the energy, the ideas, the fresh perspective to solving justice problems. And I work at HiiL, and even with my my work here in Nigeria, supporting justice innovations, we can see exactly what the effect is when young people are involved in ideating on justice problems, because we are here, we see what's working, we are closer to the grassroots in that sense. So we understand how to solve this problem. And even with my work as a next gen fellow with the engine room, where we have a group of young change makers who are ideating, coming up with different solutions to different problems, even in the justice space, we can see exactly what the effect is. However, we see that to make this thing scale, to have a lot more impact, to touch more lives, we need funding. We need to be able to access this funding without setting barriers or even challenges, because we see that, when young people have access to funding, when we don't have limited resources, we are bold enough to dream, we are bold enough we have the freedom to ideate, we have the freedom to think about initiatives that can scale. And across the world, globally with different initiatives, young people are definitely solving different problems. And I think that based on that, the ask again is that, players, actors in the justice space actually prioritize, yes, access to funding or prioritizing funding is good, but also being able to prioritize funding for young people that have initiatives and are showing exactly what's working. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelechi. Katie, did you want to come in and reflect on what he said?
Yeah. Thanks so much for having this broad panel. And it's great to hear from Kelechi. I just want to say, Kelechi, please don't discount all of us older people. We really try and ideate, and we really try and learn, and we really try and do better. And it's great to hear those perspectives and to be accountable to you, your generation. That being said, we're still in decision-making positions, we older people, and we got to try and do better. So as we're among friends, and we all agree that there needs to be more focus on financing justice. I'll say justice rather than the sector. I'll say people-centered justice is clearly a priority. We all are in agreement around that. And we're all in agreement that that needs to come both in advanced industrial economies as well as in countries that are further behind with regard to, let's say, the economic and social indicators. So we all agree on these parameters. And I think that what I'm struggling with in the conversation is, in a way, the question, Claire, that you put on the table, it isn't an either or. We clearly have to acknowledge the bigger picture whilst also working on frontline services. I mean, there's no question. And I think where I'm struggling is the idea that this is new. I don't think this is new. I think that many actors in the rule of law sphere and many paralegals and many civil society groups and organizations, for example, under the legal empowerment framework, have been really heavily engaged in this work for a long period of time, and long enough to demonstrate that that doesn't necessarily create either a broader respect for justice or rule of law, or necessarily the sustainability at national level, which is really the critical piece, right? The sustainability and the ownership at national level. So I think we know that, we're all in agreement there. And the question around like incentives and where we see change, I think like we really do need to stop saying we need more and really try and have the harder conversations around what that takes. And I'm saying already, I don't have all the answers. And what I do know is that when you, and I think it's very interesting to use the parallel of education and health and look at where we have an entry point for having, let's say, an approach to this work which seems accessible because it has the word frontline. So it sounds interesting and innovative and new, right? I understand that, and I think that's really useful. But when one thinks about education and health as sectors and as big pieces of social policy and social welfare policy at national level, they are populated with academics and experts who've thought about systems of support to health and education over the years as a policy imperative of governments across the globe. We don't actually have such a big population of thinking around what that means in the justice sector. What we have is a bunch of lawyers, mostly us, who've mostly been really good at doing law, representing people, providing advice, and latterly, as we transition into decision-making situations within ministries or in development organizations, we become people who are really good at thinking about how institutions develop, how policies should develop, how services should be provided. And that is a really complex domain that isn't the natural domain of lawyers. And it doesn't have the same breadth or background or depth that other sectors have had. I would like to see us go there, if I could retire seeing that, which you've got like 7 years to make that happen, people, because if we could see that change, then our young justice leaders will bring their thinking to the policy-making domain as well. And that's what we need. So I think that all of these things go together. I just think I think sometimes the apples and pears thing is sort of bothering me a little bit. So I just wanted to get that out there. And then I think regarding my point about the outcomes is when we're talking about development aid specifically, not necessarily national imperatives, I actually don't think it takes a generation to bring about the types of changes that we need to see improved governance. I think we've seen many countries move very quickly. Sierra Leone is a great example of how quickly changes can come that are very positive. And I would like to just have you think about the opposite, is how quick changes can be rolled back. So we can't always be saying it takes 2 or 3 generations to bring about democratic governance or effective, responsive and accountable services under the SDGs. We have 7 years. It takes just 1 year to move really seriously backwards in terms of human rights and rule of law. So let us focus on the fact that this can be done and can be done quickly where there's political commitment to do so. There you go. That was my little intervention.
Thanks, Katie. Shelley, I know you want to come in, but I think Marcus has responded online and wants to maybe respond directly to Katie. Over to you, David and Marcus.
No, Marcus, please go for it.
I think the word I want to use is balance. I just think we need to strike the right balance, and I don't think we've got the balance right, both on domestic budgets and on aid budgets. And I'm struck again, David, coming back to this issue. What do we learn from health and education? They took a very deliberate decision to earmark, quite significant proportions, 20, 30%, sometimes actually in some cases 50% for supporting primary services, because they recognized this was the most cost-effective way of achieving health outcomes to the largest number of people. And I think the more we do these legal needs, the more we see that these frontline services are a very effective way of reaching this group of people. And the more we look at the Malawi PASI, model for supporting prisoner paralegals, we know we can shift the dial for particular groups of people as well. But I think a bit of earmarking would be quite helpful. So I hear the views around the table for doing that, and I think that may be indeed be a one way forward. It certainly focuses people's attention on the issue, and I think can be a helpful way of changing approaches. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Shelley, over to you.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say a few things quickly. One is, I think the conversation is about a number of things, and one is shifting our existing resources that we already have and are putting into justice or related human rights related programming in a way to make them make them more outcome specific, give metrics that people agree on across donors and governments and civil society that we're all working towards, making what we have as existing pools much more effective. And I think that's a really important point that we don't want to miss in this conversation. For us, that our USAID policy is also an indicator or a pivot for us across the US government, trying to make all our existing resources now align them more across the government, which is a difficult task, but to make what we do already more effective. And then there's the question about justice budgets in countries and how do we make these more effective? How do we use metrics? How do we work? Those of us who do work directly with ministries of finance, with ministries of justice, with the formal institutions that we're all talking about, how do we have conversations about new budgeting models and metrics that actually make, again, resources that are going into this sector more effective? And then there's the question of, are there new resources? How do we access those new resources? And what are those new resources used for? For us, we really think that country-specific conversations are really important in all three of those dimensions. And sometimes in these global conversations, you sort of lose that country specificity that you really need. Data is great at the global level, but you really need the legal needs surveys at the country level. You really need the capacity to do this research at the country level, in the communities, in civil society, and within government and other stakeholders to do this work. And we have to work country by country. I think the global shift in conversation is extremely important, and our policy is about that. But we really need to be working in countries to scale up. And that scaling up, it might look different in different countries, as ODI's excellent research shows. Different countries have different models and approaches. So I love the conversation, and I think it's a very important one. It's not to put the global conversation or what are we trying to achieve aside, but it's trying to take it to the level of, and I think we do need to really take it to the level of examples in countries and be able to show that this is possible. And I agree with Katie that it doesn't need to be generations. I think we no longer have the generations. We can't do that anymore. We can't talk about that. And I'm certainly the young people do not want us saying, it's going to take another 20 years for us to help support and deliver change.
Thank you, Shelley, and all the right points. I think the value of the global conversation perhaps is that it can lead to more coherence at the national level, because that's, I think, another thing that we often miss at national level, where maybe different donors, different implementing agencies, bring in different ideas of what the government and civil society should be doing. So if we can get some coherence at this level, if we have $100 to invest in justice, maybe $40 need to go to judiciary, or $50 need to go to judiciary and formal system, or $60 need to go there, but $20 should go in for frontline services, $10 must go in for data. If we can at least at a global level arrive at place where we can start talking about how do we invest in justice to see meaningful change in people's lives. That would be the value of this, but absolutely agree with you. This will make no sense if it doesn't translate into action at the national level. Andres, you want to come back, your reflections, and then there are a few questions online, and I know you want to speak, and there was a question that was handed over by someone else.
Very quickly, I don't think if today justice is underfunded, it's not because we don't have results and data and lack of knowledge of what we need in the justice sector. That is, to me, out of question. If we don't have enough budget for justice, it's not because we lack data, we lack experts that we have in health and education. We already have a lot of data that tells us. I think what Claire and Marcus are trying to do is to show us some initiatives that we can support more. If you're talking about scaling, if we're talking about increasing funding, if you're talking about seeing how results can be more visible, that I agree. But I can't, to be honest, everyone who is seated here, they know what the needs are. And we have existing reports. Where are we getting the 5 billion point something, 1 million point something that is lacking justice? That is data already. And we need to, probably what we need to do is to look at how best we support these grassroots initiatives that can give better results. It's not about lack of data. It's not about lack of, being, I mean, if you are talking about not measuring results correctly, I will understand. We can work on that. But it's not because we don't know the issues. We know what the issues are. And all we need is to invest.
Absolutely, Andres. But I think the question, again, which we also had a bit of discussion yesterday in the data issue was, we know that we are doing good work at the grassroots level, but are we collecting data to be able to show donors to invest in us? Are we collecting cost effectiveness data? Are we saying this is how we can go to scale and we will not be limited to these 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 people? So those are the things that we perhaps could do better to get donors to invest into our work. But Adrian, did you want to come in?
Sure.
Oh, I thought you raised your hand.
Yeah, I did.
I
I just thought there were others in line, so I was waiting patiently. This is very useful, and it's more reflection. I think I really take the point what's useful at a global level and then what's more useful at a national level. And so here we are at a global level, and I think there's some themes percolating around when are we talking really about human rights questions and declining democratic governance, shrinking civic space, and justice in that sense, which maybe falls more under rule of law, which is at 16.3. And when is it a bit more problems endemic to poverty, to exclusion that you kind of get in every society in day-to-day life, and that's even a bit more the civil problems, disputes, and in some sense there's nothing new and everything new. I think what's new, actually, we do have better data now, just on the legal problems out there, and we do have better, starting to have data on how to begin to go to scale more on the day-to-day problems. And so I think what could be useful, we're finally at a stage, I think, maturing as a field, where usefully we can be a little bit more clear. We're talking about this, and mapping out then what are the main research questions in the data. I think the higher level questions that Katie mentioned, when is the everyday justice problems and legal service linked to rule of law? Let's not put the pressure on us to answer that now, because that may take a generation to get enough data experiment. And what little is Rachel Gisselquist has a nice paper through the UN University on democracy support seems to work. Don't try to go the step level of cutting up my intervention of this type. And so broadly, let's say it's supportive, and then really be more nuanced on what we need on data and different. And that's some of the support we're trying to do at IDRC Canada. We're very clear on legal empowerment, what we're trying to do, and it's higher level questions about community participation, shrinking civic space. We're very clear on justice data. This is more everyday problems. And let's map that out, put our pressure on ourselves to be very clear how we're talking and fits it into a larger ecosystem of support and knowledge, and not try to just, it all links together, which is maybe where we were 20 years ago, and just talking across and not having that sophistication. I think it's there, let's give ourselves credit, but now push ourselves. And my indicator of success, this is what Claire and I were talking about before. I go to a community medical clinic in my neighborhood. It's a bit like, and there are posters on the walls from master students who are interviewing elderly people to find out how they get good access to medicine when they can't leave the home. It's such a micro level thing, but that's the kind of research that's taken for granted. That's the systems thinking and learn. If we can get there in 10 years, rather than just a critical mass of legal service, legal needs surveys, I think we're getting somewhere. And that's that trend. I'm with you. We can get there by the end of 2030 and mapping that out and then shifting balances of funding to R&D and where we do it. That will be really good. Our own work, we're very much worried about crumbling rule of law, shrinking civic space. And I don't know how much knowledge and evidence gets you there. It's going to help us get there, but it's a much larger challenge. So thank you. Hopefully I was 3 minutes.
Thank you, Adrian. Let us shift gears and maybe move to a young person. Here we have Oshis. Oshis is a child advisor with sorry, I can't find Oshis your details. Just give me a second. But maybe you can introduce yourself, Oshis.
Okay, so my name is Oshis and I'm a child delegate from Nepal. So I had something to say about the holistic approach of using money. Like if you are investing something in the sector of justice or anything maybe, then like investing it for a short period of time, why don't we invest it in like a holistic approach, which will help like now too and in a sustainable way in the future too. So sorry, I talk a lot about children's and yeah, it also applies to children. If we invest in a holistic approach, like give education to them, give new skills to them, then they will learn something and they will approach a good financing in future. And the holistic approach I think works good with like everything for smarter financing. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Oshis. Jennifer, did you want to come in very quickly and then we can move online?
Thank you. If I can just reflect, thank you, Oshis. And I'm Jennifer Davidson. I'm the lead for the Working Group on Justice for Children, which is part of the Justice Action Coalition. And we today are launching, you may see the Smarter Financing for Justice for Children that you may wish to take a look at. And we are coming into this conversation from perhaps a slightly different angle, but one that I think resonates with much of what's been said around the room, which is recognizing that the investments that we're putting into children's development has a lifelong effect, not only for that child, but for society. We recognize in other research like health and education that the returns on investment for governments are significant and indeed have direct correlations to the increased GDP. And so we're thinking together with our working group on how we then take forward investments in relation to children and justice to ensure that the changes that are happening at a donor level that we've been hearing about today can be taken on board, perhaps as Shelley was speaking about the metrics and the various budgeting models, that we're thinking about the impact of financing justice for children as part of those wider issues, because we recognize in the research that the multiplier effect of the funding in these kinds of areas that are more holistic, as Oshish has been speaking about, has long-term implications that will enable the kind of outcomes that we're looking for as a society. And if we were to be really specific around what justice system outcomes we'd be looking for, I would suggest that some of the evidence we've heard from the panel today about remand and reducing numbers of children on remand is a no-brainer for us. And actually, I would suggest, without wanting to create competition between different priority groups, because I recognize we're not going to have justice for all unless we have justice for all, including children. But in this context of investment and the value of government investment, the return on that investment, if we're understanding the benefits appropriately, both short-term and long-term for the child and for society, those benefits are a very clear, compelling argument to be investing in a holistic approach.
Thank you, Jennifer. Last question from the floor. Karthik, you wanted to come in?
I mean, I'm not the way so
that's okay. So maybe first you, then Karthik, and then we have online questions, and we'll move online.
Okay, thank you. From the research of ODI, I have seen like 20%, 27% of the budget is falling for access to justice. But I have also seen that low-income countries are financing much justice. I'm wondering how much is being put for the legal aid service delivered to the people. Did you also get the information for that?
Shall I answer or
You can answer.
Okay, just very quickly. It's an area where more research is needed. There are examples of countries who are putting their own resources into frontline services. The Sierra Leone is a great example of that. The Legal Aid Board that our research suggests is meeting about 50% of the justice needs in Sierra Leone is almost entirely funded from the Sierra Leone government's own resources. It's absolutely extraordinary. But in terms of delving into national budgets and finding out how much goes to frontline services, we need to do more research on that.
Yeah. Because most of
Thanks, Swati, and sorry we came in a bit late, but there was another event on this theme taking place organized with the World Bank, which is launching a major partnership now on justice, and many of the same issues were being discussed. I saw some of the same colleagues there as well. So I guess one benefit of having this conversation at the international level is it helps us coordinate better. And many people pointed out the work of the Justice Action Coalition and the great efforts that are being done here, and linking up with that. The second issue, I guess, to me, that would be useful to explore is we've got a set of good practices and principles and rough indicators about what works and where. Like the intersection of that and the political economy of specific countries or specific contexts where you're working is I guess what would give you, like an evidence-based response to where needs are and what would be more effective also, because just knowing the needs is not enough to invest, right? You need to know what return you're going to get from your investment. And I wonder if we can, as a community, take a few contexts, particularly those of us that work on implementation as well as policy work, and try to come together in those contexts to try and apply some of these, I think, really valuable insights into a practical context. And we'd be very happy to work with, I'm from HiiL, by the way, for those who don't know. We're very happy to work with any and all of you in that regard. Over.
Thanks, Karthik. Absolutely important to think what works and to invest in it. May I now press David for you to take some questions from the class space?
Sure. Yeah, I've got a few things coming from the floor, and I'm going to try and direct them at the panelists. It's a little bit difficult to do. So if you feel that you want to answer on this, do feel free to come in. But we've got Catherine McKinnon on Live Justice Canada, and she's asked this interesting question about how, if benefits from justice often accrue to other sectors, how can we get actors, finances in areas like health to start spending some of their budgets on people-centered justice approaches? We've also got a question that I've somehow lost in the chat who it came from, and I do apologize. But we've got a question which I actually would be, I think it would be interesting maybe to go back to Jennifer Davidson to answer the question of how a greater focus on people-centered justice relates to the rights of victims and the voice of victims. And I feel that with your work with on justice for children, you might be able to touch on that point. And I think that's the main questions I have, Swati. So if that's okay, it would be great to hear maybe from Shelley, first of all, on the question of how we get other sectors to start, like health, to start putting their budgets into people's sense of justice, and then maybe from Jennifer Davidson on the questions of victims and people's sense of justice.
Thanks, David. I prefer the second question.
Go for it. Answer away, please do.
I'm happy to answer that one because I think people-centered, of course. Who are these people? Exactly what their situations are, who they are in terms of their age, their minority status, their gender. People-centered has to be obviously intersectional and specific to the people that you're talking about and serving. And so there are a lot of victims in that equation, even or survivors. And so it's a granular, people-centered has to be granular about specific communities and specific people and serving their needs and their everyday needs. And I won't go back to the question about whether everyday needs are human rights or not human rights, or however we're going to think about these services. I think the much harder question is how you get other sectors to put money towards justice, and in a very specific and targeted way. I think there are ways you could probably look at what other sectors are doing and find justice streams in a sense, but you're talking about really very intentional justice streams in health and education budgets. And I think that's a challenge. And I know that in climate justice, there are spaces where globally there are new streams coming in, and we have a lot better chance, I think, at trying to push those streams in a way towards justice than maybe we do integrating justice into already established streams where there are specific goals that those sectors are trying to achieve. But I will get back to you. I'm very new to USAID, so I don't have an answer to that, but I do think there's a very important question about integration that we have as a community and where we're going to focus. Are we focusing on trying to get justice financing as an individual thing, or are we focusing on a very integrative approach as a community? I'm not sure we can do all of it. And I'm not sure if that doing all of it also contributes to what we, I think, already have, honestly, which is quite a fragmented community at many levels. So, it's again, a choice, prioritization, agreements, coordination, these kinds of fundamental questions that we have about what we're trying to achieve, and then the processes and the approaches we want to take to achieve them.
Can I ask a follow-up question? I don't want to interrupt the flow. Sure. I was just interested as we talk about financing flows. I thought it was interesting on the chart that Marcus showed, there did seem to be quite a large spike from roughly 2006 to 2011 in terms of the overall justice financing. And I wondered if there was any success stories from that if anybody's familiar in terms of what happened in that period that we could build on, grow on, and to, I think, Shelley's point, where was that directed? Myself not knowing the history. Anybody has a sense of that?
If you can be a bit louder.
Yes. In short, wondering what was behind, if anybody has insight into what happened roughly between 2006 and 2011, which on the chart that Marcus showed included quite a large spike of financing for justice, and if there were any success stories or lessons there as to what might have generated that, and to Shelley's point, where specifically within justice that might be.
On the question of integration across sectors, I could contribute on a couple of questions, but thank you. I can't see online where the questions are coming from, but the question on integration of justice concerns across other sectors is a really important one. And within the independent evaluation office review of UNDP's work on access to justice, that some colleagues here were part of the board advising on that. You will see that one of the key recommendations is specifically on the need to make progress on access to justice, very specifically in the terms we've been talking about here, in a people-centered way, that it's really important to work with sectoral institutions in order to enable redress mechanisms, complaints mechanisms, disciplinary systems, community advocates to engage at the level of the sector to enable services to improve, because clearly a lot of grievances and issues that come up are not destined for courts. They're destined for governance institutions to adapt their behavior to enable access to other public services, particular issue for children, obviously. So it's an interesting piece, and I think it relates to what I was trying to emphasize in my short original answer around the importance of thinking about this in the work in governance terms. And that's where it's important to get to the micro level, to think a little bit about, I mean, the example you gave of a health service making itself more accessible using a community health advocate could be working with a community health advocate who also is trained in redress and discipline and other mechanisms, so they know where to direct complainants. So that's a really a critical part of us also having increasing the magnitude of our impact, not simply by thinking about ourselves as a single sector justice provision through paralegals. And I think it's actually quite straightforward to be able to do it. Apart from silos we create for ourselves as bureaucrats within the development system and within ministries at national level. But I'm sure that speaking to advocates who want to see improved service delivery within their own domains, they would also alight on these issues as being critical to the effectiveness of their own services. On the rights of victims, thank you for asking. In general, we use survivor language, but you just said, same principle. I think that really helps us elucidate the issue of context and what everyday justice means, because everyday justice needs in contexts that have been very hard hit by severe human rights violations and conflict. The everyday justice needs in those contexts of people who survived egregious violations is very specifically usually addressed under the rubric of transitional justice. And transitional justice has a complex set of approaches which include access to justice through paralegals, but include other really important engagements around memorialization, truth-telling, and macro-level accountabilities. And whilst I'm very sympathetic of working at the micro level, I'm also very aware that we can't extrapolate from contexts of everyday needs, which are understood as accessing services, to the situation of people who live in these types of egregious violations, which are ongoing. And in systems where there is very little access to accountability, simply because the governments are not allowing independent services that provide advice and representation, or even independent sort of peace building mechanisms to function. So it's a really important question. And I think that I know that the Justice Action Coalition has some focus on transitional justice. And I think sometimes the technical name obscures what's going on under that rubric. And obviously in terms of women and services for women, in particular in situations of violence, but in general, in terms of women's justice needs, I think there's a strong intersection with survivor discourse, and that is for us a critical focus in terms of developing our own access to justice policy and people-centered approach. So thank you for flagging it, it's critically important.
Sure, David, I think Jennifer wanted to come on this issue of victims, and then back to you.
Just very, very briefly, I think that I love the question about victims, because I think from a general public perspective, we can see that the general public is going to be much more comfortable with the idea of an integrated service for victims, and more comfortable with the idea of people-centered justice for victims, because we recognize we could all be victims. And I think the stigmatizing nature of offenders and the way in which we understand offenders can sometimes be a bar for our understanding of our ability to promote people-centered justice for certain groups that we're concerned about around justice. So that's a great question. From a children's perspective, there are some brilliant examples of integrated approaches to support children to be able to speak about what's happened to them to the legal system, while then immediately no longer having to address the legal needs and circumstances, and being able to move forward with their healing through an integrated service. The Barnahus model in Europe, child advocacy centers in North America are great examples of where we've started with the victim and we've said, what is the problem here? And we've brought a whole multidisciplinary group of people around that child and in that service to ensure that their needs are met, which which is a beautiful example, I think, of people-centered justice. The questions I would have for us is, especially with children, is that when we're thinking about all children being under the age of 18, even those who are offenders, I think as governments and society struggle with offering and extending the same kinds of multidisciplinary people-centered services to children who have been offenders. And I think this is something we wrestle with and becomes a real political barrier for some of the achievements we want to see for justice for children.
May I add something? Just complete. It's over to David now. David, may I add something?
Yeah, go for it, please. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me the floor, David. And just to add a little bit of nuance, so my name is Kristen Hope and I work with Tardesa. So from the perspective of what we know in terms of children who come into contact with the law, whether as victims/survivors, depending on the discourse that you choose to use, or as offenders, we also know that these categorizations, it is not a binary, and they are not mutually exclusive. You know, when we work with children who are in contact with the law, whether they are deprived of liberty, whether they are seeking support from lawyers or social workers, or in these multidisciplinary centers like the Barnahus, where they are available, say in European countries, we know that children are often both, victims, and they also may be criminalized because of the criminalization of status offenses. So for example, when we work with children who are deprived of liberty in Burundi, many girls who are in Burundi who are deprived of liberty are there for things like sexual relationships outside of marriage, or termination of pregnancy. We see in countries where street children are criminalized and deprived of liberty because they're in a street situation. So I think also, when we look at the way that the law functions, it criminalizes certain behaviors, certain identities. The criminalization of LGBTQI identities is also something that we're working with more and more. And so I think that, to your point, Shelley, which was beautifully put, people-centered justice must be intersectional. And when you look at the lived justice experiences of children around the world who are in contact with the law, we realize that it illustrates that intersectionality. And I think it asks us all questions about how we respond in ways that are attentive to those needs and to those lived realities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Our time, unfortunately, is beginning to draw to a close. I somewhat suspect that we could talk for another hour and we would still be beginning to unpack these issues. I think the richness of this conversation, which I'm not going to try and summarize, is one of the good news stories that I think we have for the last 4 years of work since the first SDG summit. Taking into account what Katie said, this is a pivot, a change that has been a long time coming. It certainly goes back to the work of the Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor, but I think there has been an acceleration of progress since the SDGs were agreed, and I think we're beginning to change expectations of what the justice system can deliver in terms of both outcomes for both people and for societies in ways that points to the future. This takes time, though. Some of these equivalent shifts in health took 20, 30 years to play out in full. We're seeing a shift in education now from access towards quality education, which is also going to take a generation to play out. But I think something is underway. We heard at the beginning from Mariette about the Justice Action Coalition. I am convinced that this is an incredibly important innovation to have a strong member state-led but multi-stakeholder high ambition coalition for justice that can work between and across geographies and institutional boundaries to drive an increase in ambition and delivery, and to take some of these global messages, as Shelley said, down to countries and begin to show that change can happen. I think the fact that the coalition has member states but is prepared to harness grassroots justice offenders, defenders, young people, innovators, the private sector, a whole range of actors is a really important part of the good news story. And then thirdly, this serious debate on financing people-centered justice. I walked around a very big field in The Hague with Marcus 4 years ago, and at the time the Task Force on Justice was working, it had very little evidence to go on these financing questions, and we're beginning to see a big revolution there. And you look at some of the, like that final slide that Teresa from HiiL presented, and you begin to see structures that allow us to think in a very, a much more serious way about driving systemic change. So a lot of good news, which I think is reflected in this conversation. But there's bad news too, and you know, many people have alluded to it. The size of the justice gap, the lack of compelling evidence that we are closing that gap either globally or in countries, the fact that budgets are under pressure almost everywhere, and that a very high percentage of money is spent either on stuff that is counterproductive, we spend money on injustice, or it's spent on approaches that are ineffective, or it's spent on approaches that cannot be scaled. So we have a significant misallocation of resources, as well as not having enough money. And we have a movement that's yet to go mainstream. I think this conversation that happened in the room and has been going back and forth on chat about how to engage with other sectors is emblematic of the need not for justice people not to be talking to justice people, but to actually be reaching out to other sectors, and then reaching out to the people with money, ministries of finance, ministers of planning, the big budget holders outside government. So what to do now? Well, I think first is to keep the faith and keep on with this journey. This is a growing movement, and I think the major priority is to do everything that we can over the next 4 years to work and support the Justice Action Coalition and make sure as many countries in that coalition are able to bring hard results to the third SDG summit in 4 years' time. Second, I was very glad to hear what Kelechi said. I think it's only the beginning, but we need some clear asks for the SDG summit. Bandwidth is very limited. UNGA becomes a more crowded event the high-level week, every single year. It seems to have more crammed into it. To rise above the SDG summit and actually get heard requires us to sing from the same song sheet and to do that in unison. So is there time? I think there is, but can we in the coming weeks come together behind 3 or 4 very clear, hard messages that can be repeated? And then third, really take this conversation out to the people with the money, to the budget holders, ministers of finance, maybe at the World Bank, IMF spring meetings, the heads of the world's leading foundations, maybe an opportunity to bring them together at the SDG summit for a private conversation. The social impact investors and the investors from the private sector, maybe at Davos, really start to systematically target conversations using the evidence we're beginning to have with the budget holders. And in the medium term, and by medium term, I mean the next year or two, that might lead to the development within the Justice Action Coalition of some kind of finance group, not led by practitioners, but led by the budget holders, led by a government, say, led by a big foundation, led by a big private sector investor, prepared to reach out to their peers and bring others into the conversation and really take this forward. If we can achieve that, then we might have a very different version of this conversation in a couple of years' time. So from me and from the UN Foundation, thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this event. We battled through thunderstorms at my end, and I'm very glad that the internet has just about held up. And I'd like to thank the panelists, thank all the organisers, and hand back to Swati for final farewells.
Thanks, David. Just very quickly to remind people, this afternoon, the Working Group of Children is launching their policy brief, Justice for Children, Smarter Financing Policy. There is also an event at the Baha'i Foundation, sorry, you're already at Baha'i, but it's hosted at the Baker McKenzie office, and it's sponsored by Canada, Mexico, and Belgium. So if you wanted more details, there's Jennifer, and there's Kristen, and there's Oshis. You can talk to them. I just wanted to thank everyone, our host, the Baha'i International Community UN office, the permanent missions of Netherlands and France to the UN, as well as HiiL, Namati, ODI, UNDP, and USAID. Thank you for all of you for your support, and thank you for joining us in person, online. It was a great discussion. Thank you.
Yeah.